Hello everyone, this is Jimmy Cultist back again with another logic video, and today we're going to be talking about how to sever limbs. Now I decided to do this in first person because I just think it's easier to aim where you want to hit, but you could do this in third person as well. So, I'm going to talk about the simple, bare necessities of what we're going to be needing. I already have the first-person character programmed, so we're going to be going over that just real quick. All this stuff is kind of unimportant, except for the damage modifier. That's kind of useful. There's also the trigger zone you're going to need. It's going to be called Cut. Set to detect tag, and you want to have it so that the zone is like this in front of the sword, at least if the sword is being swung in this direction. I've only got one animation, which is this, so it's pretty simple, but you might want to alter the area of the zone depending on which direction you're swinging. And here in the attack chip, we have this very thin switch connected to the zone so that it's only active at a certain point, with the hope of, you know, making it so you can make precise cuts, so to speak. Only at a certain point during the swing will you be able to cut. And that's pretty much all you need to know in terms of what logic you're going to need on this end. You need a zone called cut. And the damage modifier is optional, but it helps. Alright, we're going to get to our little knight fellow here. I've actually gone through the trouble to double tap and then press L1 and R2 to duplicate him. And then you press circle after that to scope out if you're still holding L1 and R2. And that will be his complete body. Now you will want to like make some of his body parts non-movable, depending on what parts need to be cut off. Another thing I would do is delete all of the bolts within his fingers, because you won't be needing those. And you can see the source bits for his various severed limbs here that I've created. There's a few problems with having every bit of him be severable, but I'll talk about those in a minute or so. Another thing I would advise is if you want his torso to be cut off, if you would like that to be a thing, I highly advise having the completed logic system for all of his other severable limbs already built in there and grouped with him, along with these little destroyers that I add later, but I'll talk about that. But just remember that you want all those grouped. And the result is you can actually, I'll show you, you can actually sever him right here. By the way, this fellow is a robot, not a real person. Just so you know, he's a good robot who serves his purpose. Anyway, as you can see, I've just cut off the whole torso, but I can also still cut him up even after this. Or at least I think I should be. Yeah, there we go. And that's kind of fun, although there's some glitchery here and there. I, personally, would not allow the player to cut the torso in half, because it's really easy to do. I feel like it'd be OP. If you want this game to be hard, I wouldn't allow for that. But also, there's some glitchery with the arms, where more arms come off than are supposed to, because the platform on which you're cutting him is unstable, and his arms will get all jumbled up and not properly trigger the way they're supposed to. But if you find some sort of logical answer to that, I will be going into some of the logic involved for how you could cut off his torso. I would stick to just the arms and the head. I didn't cover the legs, mainly because that would take extra time. So let's get down to business. But you could theoretically cut off his legs and almost every part of his body. So, first things first, we've got all these duplicated bits for each side of his body. And this might run up the thermo a bit, especially if you want the sculpt to be different. Like, say you wanted to add a tasteful cut or slice effect here. That might run up the thermo a bit, if it's a sculpt anyway. But this is what you gotta do. I would advise, if you're gonna make a game about fighting people and having their limbs severed, the entire game should be about this subject, and you should devote most of your energy to that. But anyway, these are all the pieces. I've grouped some of them. The neck and the head are technically separate, but I've grouped them. Make sure that if you take them off the puppet, they're all non-movable. The group itself is the thing you're going to want to be movable. You're also going to want to label these body parts as object and make it so they don't collide with other objects. And do that with all of them. I also make one part of it, one part of the group I make collidable. In this case it's the helmet. In this case it's the main arm, so it'll rest on the floor. I'm also going to take the puppet, if we turn these on, lights, camera, and electronics. If we go in here, I'm going to make it so he doesn't collide with objects. That way the limbs won't be tripping you up or causing any collision glitches. And you'll notice that I've got one for the elbow and one for the upper arm, and then I've got this one that's both. And that's if you decide to sever at the shoulder instead of at the elbow. Otherwise, you know, he'd just snap off, and for some reason his arm would be severed here. It'd be kind of strange, so I decided to make an entire arm. And they're not really movable, they're just like a big stiff thing, but you could make them floppy if you wanted to, if you wanted a bolt here. I would still advise leaving out the fingers, because that's a lot of extra thermo for no good purpose. And the effect will still look just as convincing without the fingers wobbling everywhere. In fact, it'd probably look more convincing. People's fingers don't tend to wobble when their arm's been severed. Anyway, enough of this balderdash. Let's get down to the actual subject. First thing I'm going to do is scope in. We're going to use L1 and X to do this, and if you want to scope out, it's L1 and circle, just so you know. I made a little bit of material here, stamped shape, and put it on mirror, if you're in sculpt mode. I've also used the grid snap to get the right alignment that I want. And I have made it non-visible and non-collidable, and since it doesn't appear, I have also reduced the detail using this in Tools. And basically, I just group it with whatever part of him I'm going to be affecting. Now, this is already a group, so you could technically just scope in, holding L2, and then L1, and then tap X, and you can scope in. But if he isn't a group, you could also just put them together and group them. But in this case, it would be redundant, since he already has a group. And I've gone ahead and grouped it here. Don't bother grouping it with that, we won't need that. The hands are not separately severable, although you could make them that way if you wanted to. It just would be more complicated and ultimately probably less effective. Anyway, I put a chip on the outside of the group, which I call limb. Pretty much all of them are called limb. And inside the chip, if we press L1 and X, we will see what does the trick. There's this little tag called cut, which, if you recall, our sword, if I can open up the logic here, has this trigger zone set to detect a tag called cut. So as soon as that trigger zone hits this, it will send an output to this emitter. Now, what does this emitter do? It emits the body part, this one specifically, for the appropriate part of the body that's being severed. And we also have this little destroyer right here, and what does this destroyer do? Well, it's just floating inside his scoped blue area. I don't know what this thing is called, but it's in here, and it's just floating right here, and it deletes his arm and the hand. You can see these two wires leading out. If you want to know how to access this, just open it up with L1 and square, and it's called Affected Objects. You can create a new wire anytime you want by tapping X on this port and connecting the wire with X to anything you want. And I went inside the emitter, which I've actually gone to the second setting. You'll see Object Just Emitted, and I've hooked that up to the destroyer. So as soon as the object is emitted, the old object will be destroyed. And I've set the speed, the emit speed, to 1.9 because I kind of want the limb to fly off a little bit. And I've set a little rotation speed, about 380, so it'll spin just a tad. I've set it to ignore apparent velocity too, or apparent speed, I should say. And it will only emit once, and it remains around for about 5 seconds, or 5.0. So it won't be around too long after it's cut off. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is. That's the logic. Now, where it gets more complicated, I'll show you in a minute. That's how you sever his limb. Now, there is a danger of, if you're trying to sever his elbow, you might accidentally sever his torso, like so. But this is still fun, isn't it? It can be a little bit complicated, you know, hitting where you want to hit. But I'll get into the areas where it's more complex. And that's if you want to prevent, like, say, you know, you sever this first little bit, and then you sever him at the elbow, right? Or not at the elbow, at the shoulder. Well, you'd be like, oh, I only need this part, because I've severed that one down there. So I'll only need this to be emitted. Well, say you strike the shoulder first, and then this thing comes out with no lower elbow, and the player is confused. They're like, I didn't cut off that, so that's weird. That's why I've got this whole arm, and it's a separate thing. So what I've done is inside here, instead of the usual single emitter, I've got these two microchips, one labeled full, and the other labeled half. So by default, if you cut this off at the shoulder, it will be a full arm that is emitted in here. And right here you can see that the object just emitted connects to this destroyer, but the destroyer also destroys this arm and this hand. So making sure the entire hand, arm is destroyed before emitting this entire arm. Make sure you get that right, because that could be a little confusing and it'd be an easy oversight to miss. But we've got the cut thing, cut tag leading right in here. We've also moved them to about here. This is basically the area in which you want to aim if we're going to cut off his limb. You can move it around by opening up this thing with L1 and square, and just pressing R2 and moving this wherever you like. It's in 3D space, so it can be a little finicky. But this selector is what decides whether or not a full arm gets cut off or a half arm. I've connected the A output to the default, which is a full arm if you cut at the shoulder. However, I have it so that it can alter if you first cut the elbow, which I will show you down here. This tag at the elbow will turn the B input, or operand 2, I think it's called. No, I think that's variables. The B input, whatever, it's active. If it's active, this half emitter will be active now, and it will only emit the upper shoulder and upper arm. So, yes, cut it up here, and only half will be altered, but if you cut up there, it will remain at the default and destroy the ability to cut off the lower elbow. Like so. I'll demonstrate it, I guess. Cut the lower. And then the upper. Yes, nicely diced. Now, there aren't very many games that have this kind of thing in them, but the few that do tend to be like zombie games, because it's kind of hard to take seriously that someone could lose their arm and still be walking around. So I'd keep that in mind if you're going to design a game like this. Secondarily, when talking about the torso, I kind of made it so that there's a switch that activates this, and it doesn't destroy the actual emitter or the cut tag, so it's a little different because it uses the switch. I've also got this wireless transceiver called Kill. So connect the tag output to this counter, connect the counter full to signal to receiver, and it will send out a message called Kill. Now what Kill does is inside the puppet's logic, I've got this thing called Dead, and Kill this wireless receiver, which I've set the zone right about here where I expect it to be triggered, as you can see. If you want to know where it's at, just use L1 and square to open this, and you can clearly see it. You can move it around with R2, and you can even change the shape of the zone and the size, but yeah, it's hooked up to a counter, which is hooked up to a timeline set to sustain. In here I have an action recorder set to sustain, and also set to keyframe mode. And what I've done here is I've copied out his on the ground animation, which I will show you. On the ground animation, and if you just hold X, you can drag and create this little zone and collect these. Press L1 and R2 and you can move this forward. And basically, because it's cut off by the end of the timeline, as you can see, he'll be permanently stuck on the ground so long as power is being applied to the timeline. And because we have a counter that's on, it will be permanently applied. I've also got this action recorder, which turns off his hurt animation, which you can see here is hooked up to a switch. So once I turn off this microchip, it'll automatically be unable to function. That way, when we hit his body, he won't keep twitching. I've also turned off his procedural animations, which I've hooked up to this little switch. But if you want to know how to turn them off separately without the stupid switch, they're in here, and just tap X on them and they'll be turned off with this thing. If you have anything else that you intend to put in your enemy, like movement logic for him to chase you, I would also turn that off with this keyframe, but he's very simple, so I haven't added any of those things. Another thing you could have is a big old destroyer inside this zone that just, deletes the appropriate logic you want to get rid of. If you want to add affected objects, just delete something when he dies. Just put it there and hook the counter up to it, and voila, you won't have any trouble turning that stuff off because it doesn't exist anymore. But anyway, this is unimportant. Alright, so that's how you get him to die when the appropriate number of limbs have been cut off. But the thing that's tricky is all of these arms would still be around, so you're going to need a sort of master destroyer that's connected to all these bits, which can be a bit confusing. All the hands, all the elbows, and and the head, and the chest, and the middle, of course. But that's pretty much all there is to that. I actually think the head is the simplest, although I will talk about something concerning the head. I've added a little bit of logic on this head chip where if you cut off both arms, the inputs for these upper shoulders, anyway, will go to these counters, as you can see, output to these counters, and they go to an AND gate, which means both of these ports have to be active for it to send out a signal called kill. So if you cut off both his arms, he will die, I'll just demonstrate that real quick. Dead. And the other thing about the head logic, though, is it's pretty simple because the only thing you have to delete is the head and the neck with this destroyer. And it will also send out a kill signal similar to the torso. I would actually advise not having the torso in your game because there's a lot of glitchiness that occurs with it. It's not so bad. Sometimes it's convincing, but other times you'll get like multiple arms flying out like that, like how to regrow his elbow. But, you know, if you just want to have fun, I would advise maybe putting it in because it's hilarious and I love it. But if you want to be realistic, don't, because it's very finicky. Look at that. 3-armed man. Doesn't make any sense. Also, it's not very common that games allow you to attack the torso. I can't think of many. Usually they just allow you to cut off the limbs for tactical reasons or the head. Like in Dead Space or things like that. But that's pretty much how you chop off limbs, you know? It's not much more complicated than that. Now, making all the duplicate pieces, and especially if you want the torso to be cut off and still have it so you can sever the limbs, that could be a bit complicated. Also, if he's running and you want it so that you cut off his legs and then he starts crawling, that would be a bit more complicated. I'm not really going to cover that in this video because this is more or less just the concept. But, you know, if you know how to make things go into different modes using selectors, it'd be fairly easy to make him crawl instead of walk, if even, you know... I don't have him moving, of course. But the concept is the same. Oh, another thing I'd like to mention about, you know, the dead animation is that I kind of designed it in such a way that it would look good no matter what part of his body was cut off. But I didn't really keep the legs in mind, so you'd have to have a different death animation if his legs were cut off. I made it, though, so if his head was cut off, you know, him falling down would look fairly natural. If both arms were cut off, it would look fairly natural. Or if his torso was cut off, just his legs going down would look fairly natural. But keep that in mind when designing your animations. Yeah. That's pretty much it. Oh, I guess there is a little thing I could say about severing limbs. I had this initial idea where when you sever certain parts of him, he'll actually react in pain. Like if you sever his shoulder, he'll grab his side, and that would be as simple as just, you know, sending inputs to this node, depending on which part of him is chopped up. But if you chop multiple parts, it could kind of overlap and be tricky, and that would be a whole lot of nonsense to go through. So I kind of advise against that. But if you really want to, this is kind of how you would do it. Timeline set to play once, node, not gate. Maybe have, if you duplicate it, you know, if you have like the left side, have it so that there's a switch connected to the animation. Or you could just duplicate this, put it on the timeline, and have the switch hooked up to that. Set it to sustain, of course. And have it so that when the right side is cut, the left side is inoperable and he won't do that animation, and vice versa. Just to show you how to interrupt that. But yeah, that's pretty much all the subject matter. I guess there is a little thing about the torso. I've made all the springs and bolts in here. I've added a certain amount of springiness, 80%, so that they won't be all floppy when you get... I mean, they're a little floppy, but they're not as floppy as they ordinarily would be. Like, he's kind of more stiff. So I think that looks better. Another thing I'd advise is, it's kind of unrelated, but slightly related. When he dies, make sure that his pelvis is not too close to the floor, because these puppets have a tendency to actually sink into the floor. Like, if I put his pelvis down here, he'd like sink through the level and fall through the floor. So keep it somewhat high. This blue indicator right here, it gives you an idea of how high you want it. Don't have it below that thing, otherwise he'll sink through the level. Just a little side note. But anyway, yeah, that's all I have to say on that subject. Hopefully you'll find this useful if you're making your own PG game.
Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts, leave a comment, and if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss future videos. That's all for now. Goodbye.